Welcome to the State of Affairs in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago and Intelligencer Today. Pleasure to bring back a good friend, Colonel Doug Macgregor. Welcome back.
Happy to be here.
Let's jump right into it. We just witnessed a debate between two presidential candidates. One of them was left out, and we should also bring that up, Robert Kennedy Jr. But what is your take, at least on the two men that we saw the other night?
Well, I didn't think it was much of a debate. It struck me as two men who rattled on almost independently of each other. No one really listened to the other one and tried to counter or comment on anything the other one said. I didn't think it was very useful, frankly. And I was disappointed because a lot of things were left out, were never discussed. Certainly the foreign policy issues. I didn't hear any systematic discussion of what could be done with the economy and our financial situation. I think, the Trump's, what's the right word, overhauled version of Reaganism has absolutely no chance whatsoever of succeeding in this country. Our position is so bad economically and financially. The last thing that we can afford to do is cut taxes. What we must do, though, is cut government spending. And we know that government spending is more than a third right now of gross national product. So we're in a lot of trouble. Nobody really brought any of that up. No discussion of Ukraine, no discussion of the Middle East, sort of vague references. And then finally, nobody really understands just how dangerous these open borders are. How many times do you have to tell somebody Hezbollah has an operating base involving tens of thousands of people in Mexico? It's been there for a long time. Now, I'm not advocating war with Hezbollah or Iran or anything else. I'm simply pointing it out. But there are people in Washington who seem to want to go to war with Iran. Has anyone considered what could be done to us here? And I don't think they have. ISIS is another one. There are many, many people that have come from Syria and northern Lebanon, as well as Iraq, who are now settled in Mexico. Yes. Everyone talks about the Chinese. The Chinese problem is normally an economic one, the ability of the Chinese to come in and buy up your politicians. We know that works. We've seen the Israel lobby do that very successfully. So why shouldn't the Chinese try to do the same thing? I am very frustrated with that. Then you hear these things on the news. Another 11-year-old girl is raped and murdered by a quote unquote allegedly Venezuelan gang members. Then somebody follows up and says, well, I think that's the same gang that raped Riley Lakin up in the Northwest. Good God. I don't see people in the streets enraged, carrying torches and demanding action. Americans are armed. I would think Americans would want to go to find the local sheriff and be deputized and start going after all these potential criminals. It hasn't happened. So
what is it that has gotten us so pacified? Why don't we react?
Part of it, I think, is complacency, because too many of us are fat and comfortable. Every time I travel around the United States, I see too many fat people. When you're fat, you're comfortable. You sit there, you eat bad food, watch bad nonsense on the television, and you essentially dismiss whatever is wrong as something that happens in somebody else's state. We got to get past that. We've lost our sense of community in the United States. There is no societal cohesion. And I think that's the other problem with the massive influx of all these foreigners. They're different from us. That doesn't make them bad, but they didn't come here to become Americans. They're here to somehow or another benefit from what they think is the giant consumption machine. Go to America, buy a ticket of entry, go into it, and then you can run around and collect freebies, free things, free services, free healthcare, free medical care. And you may be able to make money because people will pay you even though you're an illegal. I saw data recently where the job market remains pretty stagnant for American citizens, but it's been great for illegals. Yes. We're hiring illegals, but we're not hiring Americans. Why? Well, you don't have to pay the illegals as much. I don't see any of the usual suspects with the labor unions raising hell over that.
You, after the debate, gave a great statement and called for an early election. That gave a lot of people some food for thought, a lot of discussion that I think is viable and relevant. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I hope people saw it, but I know we've had at this point over 2.5 million views. That's still a drop in the bucket. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't more views that we don't know about, because you never know who reposts and sends more of these videos out. But the video itself was simply said that let's stop kidding ourselves. This man, President Biden, is unfit to be president. He's unfit for reasons of age and mental acuity. That's obvious for anyone to see. So why should this go on? And several people said to me, well, that's why the 25th Amendment is there. I said, I understand that, but we've got a bigger problem than Joe Biden. We're dealing with a government that is actively engaged in systematically destroying our society. If anyone thinks that open borders are a benefit, they're going to have to show me, because I see no evidence for that at all. I see the opposite.
Absolutely.
And this man, Mayorkas, is leading the crusade to bring more people in here with every passing day. And when you bring the issue up to him, he pulls out his badge of honor. I'm Jewish. You can't say that. That's anti-Semitic, and I'm a refugee or something. It's all nonsense. Has nothing to do with it, and he knows it. But he hides behind that, and that's so common these days in Washington, D.C. It's frightening. So I think, you know, we've got to get rid of the government. You can't do that with the 25th Amendment, but you can do it if you hold an election early. And people say, well, you know, that it says the first Tuesday in November. I'm aware of that, but there's nothing to prevent Congress, the House and the Senate, from voting to hold elections early. That can be done, and that would be legal. Now, here's the key point, though. Will the House and the Senate do that? How many times have we watched as so-called Republicans, excuse me, deserted and then sided with Democrats to pass legislation that was destructive to us? In other words, lip service to America first, but in reality, vote America last. And I think that's what we're seeing over and over and over again, because it's rewarded. You know, it's rewarding financially for the members to do that. They have lobbyists pushing money into their pockets. Now, no one's going to stand up and explain it in detail, but it's true. There was a man named Buck from Westminster, I think it's Westminster, Colorado, outside of Denver. He was in for 2 terms and he finally left, but he wrote a book, The Swamp is Deeper Than You Think. And he describes very clearly what happens to you when you show up as a member of the House of Representatives on your first term, and all the pressure that's put on you to come up with all the cash that the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee demands of you, which you're supposed to get not exclusively from your constituents, but from lobbyists. Well, if you take their money, then you have to take their demands and guidance for voting. It's very obvious. So that's the other thing. We need to ask, who is governing our country? It's not Joe Biden.
Yes,
it's not
absolutely.
the Congress. Who is governing us? And that question is not being answered. Now, there were a lot of Americans that watched this video that I made, and they liked it, but I don't think enough have seen it, and I don't think enough people are upset to make any difference. I think people are willing, sadly, to sit around and wait for, you know, the disaster to arrive. It sort of reminds me of you know, the caliphate in Baghdad in the 13th century that dismissed out of hand the possibility that the Mongol armies could march all the way to Baghdad. Said, oh, they'll never get beyond the Caucasus. Oh no, they'll never get beyond the Caspian Sea. And we all know the rest of the story. And so they celebrated themselves and said, well, if they come here, they have no chance. We'll destroy them. The Mongolian army showed up and Baghdad was destroyed along with the caliphate. That's the sort of mentality. It's like watching a train come down the track and lying on the track and say, well, I'll wake up from my nap on the track before the train gets here.
Well,
good luck.
do you also think that a lot of people that do realize that we are in for some sort of a calamity, those who understand our position and who are just almost helpless, I think to the core of our bones, we all feel that something is coming. We don't know what. Do you think they also feel helpless? Not necessarily they don't want to be proactive, they don't know what to do and how to fix this.
Oh, well, I think that's true, but I think there's also something else, and it's reasonable. They're afraid of the government. They're afraid
And
of
that
the
too,
Department
yes.
of Justice. The Minister of Justice, Merrick Garland, and his trusty sidekick, Director Wray in the FBI, are absolutely true believers that the great danger to the American people is white supremacy. So if that's what you've got governing you, it's not hard to understand why this continues to happen without interruption. I don't have an easy answer. Now, we at Our Country, Our Choice are trying to pull people together across party lines. You know that. And we do have a new platform that's going to come out that I think will be very helpful. I think it actually could revolutionize things, because the biggest problem we have, as you know, is if you express a view that the regime doesn't like. And when I say regime, I'm not just talking about the Biden administration. I'm talking collectively the Washington community, all right? If they don't like it, you're canceled. You lose your position. You're fired. You're demonetized, whatever it is. So we built this new platform to get around that. And I won't say anything else. We got to talk about other things.
Sure.
But this is called
But we will
Republic.
certainly follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you would be interested in, because we're trying to build something that can survive the onslaught. We know it's coming. As soon as we demonstrate effectiveness, we'll be under major assault. And this is our attempt. So at least we can connect people across the country who are like-minded.
Yes.
And that's a big problem.
I've always
because
been on your team, so
so many people are afraid and think they're alone. They are not alone.
That is the biggest problem. I feel that, and I do speak to a lot of people as well, as you know, and yes, they are afraid for their families, for their livelihoods, and are helpless, essentially.
One of the things that Donald Trump has said repeatedly that is absolutely true. He would look at an audience and say, if the Justice Department and the federal government can do this to me, what do you think they can do to you? And he was always right about that. I wish he'd focused more on helping others, but nevertheless, he's right. And this latest decision is helpful in that connection.
And that's what I wanted to bring up. So this Supreme Court decision today, not really something we need to delve deep into, but just on the surface, what is your take?
Well, on the surface, this is a setback to those who thought they were going to quickly jail and punish Trump for basically challenging their determination to rule us against any force that might be out there. Remember, he was always hated because he was an agent for change. The thing that Washington hates most is change. Change disrupts the money flow. That's the problem. Everyone in Washington wants the money to continue to flow to its usual destinations. They're comfortable. He wanted to cut that off. He didn't know how to do it, and he was very badly advised. That's neither here nor there, but that was very threatening. The other thing is that suddenly Americans in great numbers, I'm not talking about hyphenated Americans, just Americans, came out in huge numbers to vote for him in 2016.
Yes.
Now, they seem to have found a way to compensate for that, and I'm sure the 52 million people inside our country who were not born in this country is part of that plan. That's the new formula. Dilute the American population. And they're issuing these illegal migrants. I don't give a damn what Washington says. These people are illegally in the country. They're issuing them some sort of 4-digit number, which is supposed to be the equivalent of the last 4 of a Social Security number. And they're telling them, the NGOs all the way up from Panama, and when they get into the United States, they're being told, use this to register to vote. What?
Fascinating.
This is, you know, dare I call it treason? You know, I mean, this, to
Absolutely.
me, as an American citizen, you begin to sit around and say, well, what the hell did I do for 28 years in the Army? Why did I bother putting myself through VMI and West Point and all the misery and service in the Army? I love the Army and I love my service, but let's face it, it's grueling and it's demanding, which is what it should be. But you did it because it's your country. That's part of service to the country. I believed in that. All of a sudden, I'm watching it all fall apart. And these people in Washington are cheering. That's what they want. Makes no sense.
So for all intents and purposes, we are having an election in November, hopefully. Do you think the Democrats, after this debate, I think both you and I agree that we're Biden team all the way, since he is very weak, vulnerable, and beatable if everything is fair and square. Do you think they will replace him?
Yes. And I think that's been generally widely accepted inside the highest levels and circles of the Democratic Party for at least 6-7 months. They really wanted to get him through to the convention, have him announce that he's stepping down and announce his successor. And that successor is the candidate for the presidency. Now, whether or not he is going to leave office at that point, that's another question. It doesn't really make any difference. As I was saying before, the same bad actors who are pushing all these destructive policies are going to be there whether he's there or not. But they could conceivably have him step down. They could make Kamala Harris president, and they could make his successor vice president.
Yes.
That way, the successor would then have the wealth of the United States government and the American taxpayers to fund his campaign all over the country. So I think these things are possible. Now, don't ask me. I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know who that's going to be, but we've all heard names, you know.
Sure.
And you take your pick. Is it Newsom, Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton? I don't know.
Lots of speculation certainly around that, and buyer's remorse certainly on the Democrat side. But as I said, he is weak, and if we are looking at President Trump, and also let's bring up Robert Kennedy Jr. I thought, first of all, it was very interesting that they left him out of that debate, but also he spoke about NATO recently, and we had a conversation about that. I think he was very adamant about pulling us out of NATO. What do you think about that?
Well, he recognizes that NATO is a legacy of the Cold War. In truth, once the Soviet state collapsed, Germany was reunited, and the Soviet government, that then eventually became the Russian government, agreed to withdraw their forces from Eastern Europe, from all of these formerly satellite states. There was no reason for NATO to exist. We kept it around at first as a vanity project. I know that may confuse some people, but much of what we do in Washington is really mortgaged to vanity.
Yes.
And every president likes to fancy himself as the leader of the free world. I think Biden has summarily executed that. It's gone. We're no longer seen in that light, because what he says is freedom and what others think is freedom are not the same. It's much like that word democracy. His use of the word democracy has a lot more in common with Lenin's definition than it does with what the average American believes in, and for that matter, others around the world. And you and I know that there are many forms of government, and many of them are very effective, and they're not necessarily republics like ours. And, you know, we need to get out of this business of trying to impose what we think is the answer on everybody. He's still stuck in that paradigm. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people that surround Donald Trump are stuck in it. The good news is that's not true for RFK Jr. Bobby Kennedy, I think, and I use his name cautiously. I'm not a bosom buddy. I don't know him that well, but I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. is someone who understands that we have to defend America first. Now, let me run through what that means real quick.
Sure.
That means defend us in the Western Hemisphere. That's why he went to the border. He visited the border. It was a very important event. He drew the right conclusions. This is criminal. This is wrong. It must stop. And he is quite willing to do what needs to be done to restore the rule of law. And that means that you give all of these people, say, 90 days to get out, to go back where they came from or simply leave. And you tell everyone, those of you who voluntarily leave and register with us on the way out, we will take your name down. And when things here improve economically, when our economy is truly booming and we're back in business, we'll consider you for readmission. But if you don't register with us on the way out, a couple of things can happen to you. If you stay past the limit, you're going to be arrested. You face incarceration. You will be charged as an illegal border crosser. And ultimately, if you're lucky, deported quickly, because I wouldn't want to spend any time in our prisons. I think that's where we're headed with him. I also think, because he's a very humane person, this is someone who is very sensitive to people. The other thing is he understands that this thing called NATO has become a Trojan horse for American military intervention, and as the Soviets used to say, imperialism. We weren't nearly as imperialistic as they said we were when we were opposed to them, but we certainly have fulfilled that expectation since the early 1990s. And there are a lot of people in Washington that think that the world would be a better place if the United States military occupied all of it. They're wrong. No one wants it. We don't need military hegemony or political hegemony, and the world doesn't want it. And we need to get that through our heads. So all of the things that the two standard candidates talk about is nonsense. Kennedy doesn't talk in those terms. He understands the criticality of leading by example. And that goes back to Washington. Washington said, look, if we're successful, if we're prosperous, if our government works, if we thrive economically, lots of people will want to emulate us. And that's a good thing. But we're not marching into other people's countries. We're not going to do what the Europeans do. We're not going to try to export us, our way of life, at gunpoint. And he held sway. That view tended to hold sway at least until World War I. And even after World War I, until FDR comes in, we wanted to stay out of that business. We're now neck deep in it, and it has to end. And it is going to end because financially we can't afford it. And that's what's coming. We're headed for a financial meltdown. And when I listen to President Trump and his economic recommendations, that's disaster. It's not going to work. The left has no answer except to keep on doing what they've done. So we've already walked over the cliff. The abyss seems bottomless. It's not. We're going to hit bottom. It's going to be ugly. That's where we're going.
Well, so interestingly,
RFK understands that too. He understands the central banking problem. He understands the fiscal policy problem. So I think on the whole, he did a good job during that debate when he answered the questions that they were asked that in most cases they really didn't answer very well.
Yes. Well, so interestingly, you bring up the Europeans, and there seems to be tide turning, at least in European politics. And the sovereign national parties are surging. Do you think that can somehow stop this train that's running off the rails, not only in Europe, but here? And is there some communication that can happen back and forth where the true national sovereign ideology will take not only in Europe, but here in the United States?
Well, I think we can say that is definitively going to happen in Europe. France is on the edge or verge of a revolution. Let there be no mistake about it. I don't think President Macron understands the gravity of his situation. He is finished. It's not just him, but a whole group of elites in that country are finished. That's not because I think Le Pen is a revolutionary. She's not. She's actually quite moderate if you look at it from the standpoint of conservative nationalists like myself. And that's how I describe myself, as a conservative nationalist. Sure. Dirty words, of course, for the left. They're all internationalists. Although they call themselves globalists now. In the old days, they were just internationalists. The point is that I think it's going to happen in France first. And you remember what Metternich, the great Austrian foreign minister, said, when Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. I think you're going to see the rest of Europe follow in French footsteps. I'm really anxious to see the British do the same, because Rishi Sunak is irrelevant. He's an empty suit. And the parties there are as bad as ours are here. They're uniparties that don't represent or care really about the people of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So hopefully that's going to happen. The question is, what do we do?
Yes.
And we're back to the sort of fat, comfortable Americans in their Barca lounge, slurping down beers, watching Monday Night Football. And sometimes I think the only way to get anybody's attention is to cancel Monday Night Football. Goes away. Then you'll have a revolution. I know that Paris in 1989, the trigger for the revolution was that the people of Paris could not afford to buy bread. There's actually a law in France that prohibits the price of bread being raised to a level that's not affordable. So they learned that lesson. I guess we're going to have some sort of similar experience, and we could get there quickly. We don't understand the fragility of the supply chains. We don't understand the damage we've done overseas to our reputation and how many people we have alienated and made hostile to us. We're listening to the globalist elites, the people that are sitting in front of the cameras in palatial surroundings in Europe and here. They aren't the people. And the question is, what is it going to take to get the American people to rise up? Indeed, are we going to redefine ourselves? I think that's part of the problem. We've got to redefine, who are we? What do we represent? What do we want to be? We haven't really asked those questions for a long time.
So speaking of Europe and even the events in Ukraine, conflict with Russia, lately, there have been very, very disturbing terrorist attacks on Russian territory. But there was an announcement yesterday that I saw that there is an expectation of wider terror threats around Europe. And you and I shared yesterday what happened in Serbia, in Belgrade, in front of the Israeli embassy. What is your take on this? Because it seems like we're escalating. And I cannot help but think, and I'm pretty sure we agree on that, that our intelligence services are working overtime and we are stumbling into some sort of a cataclysmic wide war.
Well, Mr. Zelensky is unambiguously a creature of MI6 in London and the CIA in Langley. Let's be frank, those two intelligence agencies have worked very, very closely together in Ukraine. The Mossad has also played a role there, but I think it's primarily being led intellectually or spiritually, whatever you want to call it, by Langley. A lot of the expert use of weapons and triggers for terrorist attacks, I think we can trace to some extent to MI6. But I don't have access to all that information, but it's pretty clear that they're the driving forces. They're rogue organizations at this point. But keep in mind that the people in control inside the White House, and we could put photographs of all the various people wandering around the White House, they're 100% behind this. They're willing to put everything at risk because they grossly underestimate Russia, just as they grossly underestimate their own people here in the United States if things go badly. Just as Macron is beginning to figure out he's in a lot of trouble, and his people are the trouble that he's got. Why do I say that? Because there is this lingering sense that if the Russians get anything right, it's an accident. If Russian military technology is good, it's an accident. There's an unwillingness to accept the real possibility that they have made great strides and they are ahead of us in a number of key categories, and that we're very much at risk of losing to them in a direct confrontation. Now, I mean losing in a conventional, high-end conventional sense. I don't even want to think about the nuclear alternative because, as President Putin has said, ultimately we all lose. Of
Yes.
course, then he has this caveat, but since we're good Orthodox Christians, we're all going to go to heaven. Okay, God bless him and more power to him, but I'd rather avoid the whole thing. I think there are still enough sane people left in the Department of Defense in Washington that the nuclear option is off the table. So I don't think that would happen. In the Middle East, that's a different matter because the Israelis have control of their own nuclear weapons, and we don't know what they'll do, but they have the capacity to use them. And if they do attack into Lebanon, Hezbollah is a very tough nut to crack. They have been preparing for this war since 1982. And they may turn to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon to break the crust, the defensive crust of Hezbollah. If that happens, then I think all bets are off. Then you suddenly make it possible for anybody to take whatever action they think is justified against Israel. And I think they would horrify the whole world. Not that they seem to care. You know, somebody keeps asking me all the time, you tell us, Macgregor, that China's not going to invade Taiwan. No, it's not going to invade Taiwan. Why not? Well, why would it? It doesn't need to. The Taiwanese are quite prepared to vote themselves into China. That's probably going to happen anyway. But why would they do it? Because if they did that, they would suddenly alienate all of Asia. Everyone in Asia would be furious. And everyone in Asia would be on Washington's doorstep asking for help. China does not have friends on its borders. Anybody who thinks North Korea is pro-Chinese is crazy. Far from it. Same thing is true for Vietnam. You know, look at India. India wants to get along with China. China wants to get along with India. But if China were to do something like that, that would sour relations with India. We don't seem to think in those terms, and the Israelis don't. Netanyahu's view is we control the world. We control the United States. That's all that matters, and we can do whatever we want. That's not true. That's never been true. Nobody's been able to ever do everything they want to do.
So what do you think is the end game at this point? We have very short amount of time before the election. Again, we often talk about whether it's going to happen or not, but let's think it will. Although, as I said, we all feel that something else may come and may happen on a wider scale that will prevent us from having this election. What is the end game here? Do we even know?
I think for the people controlling the White House and the government right now, it's propping up Zelensky to reach the election without a total implosion in Ukraine. I think that's it. They think that's a low bar. It may be. I don't know. But, you know, I don't know that the Russians will cooperate with that. The other thing is that they can go back and look at the disaster that ensued on television when we left Afghanistan. That was sort of exemplified American military incompetence. And all the usual suspects with stars on, you know, managed to run away and avoid taking responsibility for it. No one was held accountable for it. Ukraine would be much worse. And it would ultimately be much, much harder to conceal. So I think that's what they're worried about. They want to make sure that that doesn't happen before the election. I don't know that they can make that work, but I think that's on their minds. The problem in the Middle East is very simple. None of the candidates have the capability to restrain Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu has more influence over them than they have over him. It doesn't matter who's in the White House right now. So I'm afraid the Israelis are going to overreach. They're going to push further and further. And unfortunately, that raises the very high probability of a greater alignment of states against them. Now, I haven't talked very much about it, but Central Command and the Israelis are working together to essentially push the Kurds into action against the Turks in northern Iraq. That's very dangerous. But from the Israeli standpoint, that diverts Mr. Erdogan's attention and the Turkish military's resources into a potential fight down there. At the same time, Nasrallah noted that the British air bases on Cyprus have moved British and American equipment and support back and forth between Cyprus and Israel, and said, if that's the case and we are attacked, Cyprus is a legitimate target.
Yes.
Very few people noticed that the Turkish foreign minister, who is widely thought to be Mr. Erdogan's successor, was very straightforward and said, that's unacceptable to us.
Mm-hmm.
The Turks are not like us in the sense that they don't boast and bluster that much about what they can do. In other words, militarily, but they can do a lot. And they are the historic leaders of the Sunni Muslim world. And you have Iran that has made it very clear that they are not going to allow Hezbollah to be destroyed. And of course, you know, as Mr. Netanyahu points out, you have the various militias in Iraq and Syria, and of course, our friends, the Houthis. And he talks about them. Well, quite frankly, those are minor irritants compared with what he could face if he goes up against Hezbollah, because it'll bring in Iran. And
Yes.
the question is, what does Turkey do?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to allow us to use Cyprus? Are they going to put up with this Kurdish conflict on their southeastern border? Now, in the meantime, Mr. Erdogan has pulled another dramatic diplomatic coup. He has now, excuse me, recognized the legitimacy of Mr. Assad in Damascus. And certainly since about 2010, he's been doing everything in his power to destroy Assad. He's now done a 180-degree turn.
Yes, he
Why
has.
would that happen right now? Well, that opens up all sorts of possibilities in Syria and reaching Israel through Syria. And this also means that the Iranians and the Turks, who've been talking a great deal to each other, whatever their differences, they can agree on one thing. What Israel is doing is more disruptive, more destructive, and unacceptable than anything else. Then, of course, here we are. We're expected primarily with air and naval power, because we simply don't have much in the way of ground forces at the moment. We're expected to ride to the rescue of the Israeli Defense Force once it attacks Hezbollah. I think we've probably exchanged targeting data, and that aircraft carrier battle group that's out in the Eastern Mediterranean, no doubt about it, will be involved. I don't know what else could be involved there. Perhaps, I don't know if the Eisenhower is still down in the Red Sea. And of course, we have about 23 bases of various types and sizes in Syria, Iraq, Jordan. Jordan is on the edge of total destabilization. General Sisi in Egypt has pulled back, but made it clear that he will do no more to communicate with or cooperate with under any circumstances the Israelis. We have been pressuring him by telling him that we're willing to forgo or forgive his $180 billion sovereign debt if he'll let all of the Arabs in Gaza into his country. But he knows if he does that, he will be seen as betraying the Arab cause and the Muslim cause. And that means he'll be assassinated. So he's certainly not going to do that. But he may not last anyway. The Egyptian army is quite willing to fight. They may not be very good. The Egyptians as a nation are not violent people. They do not believe in interstate violence. They just don't. For that matter, neither do the Iranians. So one of the things that's worked to Israel's advantage is that nobody in the region really wants to go to war. But now Mr. Netanyahu has presented a threat to them that they cannot ignore. And that's the real tragedy. And that's why I worry that after all is said and done, he's put his own country at serious risk unnecessarily.
And he is successfully doing something that we haven't seen in a long time, which is the Sunni and the Shia uniting in this battle.
Yeah.
Very, very fascinating. Lastly, to turn back to us, with the election coming on and looking at all of the various groups that should get involved in voting and registering and participating in the civic process, we have launched yet another effort, which is the Christian Orthodox organization to do the outreach to Orthodox Christians who have essentially been here since the founding of this nation, and who, for all intents and purposes, as strong conservatives and institutionally as a church, Orthodox Christian church around the world, has not folded yet to the wokeness as have the Catholics and the Protestants and others. Thoughts on that, because I see that there is a lot, of course, that we can do together to galvanize this population that doesn't often show on the census, but it's the fastest growing Christian denomination in the country. And we have about 10 to 12 million Christian Orthodox believers in the United States.
Well, you know the history only too well, that the great tragedy of European history is the schism that has divided Christians against each other. Christians have done a much better job of killing each other than almost anybody else. And that's the way I look at the two world wars. I mean, Arnold Toynbee and any number of historians have said repeatedly, Carl Jung said this, a great psychologist, these were really civil wars where we fought with each other over trivial things, severely weakening our civilization. So uniting Christendom has always been the right thing to do that no one has managed to achieve. I don't know that we can achieve it now, but I do think that the Orthodox Christian Church has done something right. And by the way, I would argue that Muslims in their mosques have done something right too. They've said no to all of this wokeness. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone thinks that homosexuals should be executed. That's nonsense. Doesn't mean that we want to persecute everybody who doesn't agree with us. It simply means that don't expect us to legitimate things that we think, certainly from the vantage point of our religion, which is our culture and our way of life, are wrong. In other words, there is a place where truth matters. Everything is not relevant. You know, when I came in the Army, I had a non-commissioned officer that worked with me. He was a great man. And he used to line up the new soldiers coming in. And he was a funny guy. He would say, I know you've all heard of this book. It was real popular in the 1960s. It was called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Well, I got a book for you. I'm okay, you're not. And he then proceeded to lay down the law of what was expected. Well, we got to get rid of I'm okay, you're okay, because that's not right. There has to be a guiding principle that leads us on the path to success. And I don't think we have that right now, but I think that the Orthodox Church is unique at the moment in having done that. Now, in defense of the Roman Catholics, as you and I were talking about earlier, you have Archbishop Vigano,
Yes.
who has led a crusade against the current Pope, whom he regards as a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
I was always disappointed when I saw Billy Graham show up in the Clinton White House to bless Clinton. Why he did that is beyond me, because I don't think a younger Billy Graham would have ever done such a thing. Everybody has compromised so many times. Very, very suddenly you wake up and decide, well, what have you got left? And the Orthodox Church hasn't done that. So I think that's why it's growing, and I think that's why it will be successful. But I hope that you can still reach out and other Christians can reach out to you, because that's a huge chunk of the American population. In fact, I had a Muslim who was a doctor from Syria who's up in Boston ask me, well, I agree with your values. I believe in our country, our choice, and there's nothing I disagree with, but I'm a Muslim. Can I be a member? I said, of course you can. You know, if you adhere to those principles that we've been discussing, what makes us Americans, and I always go back to the Bill of Rights. You know, we must insist on freedom of speech, must insist on all of those things. You know, the Constitution is a wonderful document, but that's going to be changed. It's been changed before. That's about how we govern ourselves. But the Bill of Rights, you've got essentially the political equivalent, if you will, of the 10 Commandments of the Bill of Rights. Yes. It cannot be compromised. Everybody has to get on board with it. And I hope we can do that. That's one of the things we're trying to do at Our Country, Our Choice. I know that's what you want to do. And we can't get there if we're going to quibble over lots of minor things that people sometimes think are important, but really aren't. Not if they stand in the way of unity and success.
I agree with you. We have Christian Orthodox coalition in the United States, our country, our choice. We're all fighting the same battle. And I pray to God we will be successful. Thank you for being with us again.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Olga.